I'll be covering what I believe to be the most important points about choices that a breast cancer survivor can make. We won't, of course, be able to cover everything, but if you have any burning questions, especially for areas that I haven't covered, then feel free to bring them up. And I'm happy to take questions. I don't quite know how we're going to do this, but I'm happy to take questions actually throughout the talk. If there's something that you feel needs to be fleshed out or you disagree with, for example, then we can take questions throughout the talk as well. But there will also be a question and answer period at the end if there's a question that only comes up at the end. So our goals. Let's be really clear what goals are, because often we get caught in the weeds and we forget the high points, which is we want to improve quality of life. We want to reduce side effects, recurrence rates, and death. We want to reduce total mortality. And that's a really, really important number, I think, that often gets forgotten. We want to reduce the risk of other things happening. Breast cancer patients don't just get breast cancer, they get everything else that anybody might get. So if we aren't reducing the risk of things like the burden of diabetes, heart disease, stroke, dementia, disability of various kinds, we aren't really doing our full job. And also relieving the burden of frequent health care. Many in the audience can speak far better than I to what a burden it is to have a medical illness. And if we can reduce that burden so you're free of people like me, then that alone is a worthwhile objective, I think. So in terms of trying to approach that, we're going to be covering a couple of areas. One is we're going to target insulin resistance as a concept. And that involves your waistline, your diet, especially sugars and starches, the fact that certain diets seem to work a lot better to target insulin resistance, the Mediterranean diet, the role of extra virgin olive oil, and activity. And then because they're burning topics that I was asked to touch on, we're going to talk about soy, alcohol, flaxseed, dairy, and vitamin D as well. Just briefly on insulin resistance. It's a relatively complex issue. It's associated with this idea that your cells, which require glucose, and insulin is the key that allows glucose into the cell, that the cells become resistant to the effect of insulin and need higher and higher quantities of insulin to let the glucose into the cell. That's it in a nutshell. You can know that you've got insulin resistance because you've got things like a broad waistline, high blood pressure or treated high blood pressure, low HDL cholesterol, high triglycerides, and borderline blood sugars. Those are all markers to say, wow, I'm in that group. But the broad waistline is the driver of all of this, and so we'll really be talking about broad waistlines. Just keep that concept in mind. Don't worry too much about the details of insulin resistance, because I think the details, the contributing factors will be obvious enough by themselves. So, first of all, let's think about sugars, carbohydrates, obesity, this concept of insulin resistance, and cancer in general. And there's not a straightforward connection. It involves the waistline, the diet, being inactive, and we'll keep coming back to this activity issue, the insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes as the ultimate marker of the worst of insulin resistance. And this is how I construct the whole issue. This is my sort of view, that there's not a simple linear line between A and cancer. What it is, we've got this central obesity issue, we've got the diet issue, we've got the insulin resistance and inactivity. It all feeds in various ways that depend on your environment, your genetics, and other factors. So let's just look at the obesity issue to start with, and you'll notice all of my key items do give a reference to the standard mainstream medical literature. So if you want to look up and see if I'm making stuff up or not, then you can do so. So in terms of obesity, postmenopausal obesity seems to increase the risk of breast cancer in most studies. It's associated with worse disease as well. If you gain weight after you're diagnosed with breast cancer, you tend to not do as well. If you're postmenopausal and you're overweight, you're less likely to do as well as those who are not. And we think that this insulin resistance concept is an issue that combines all these. If you're looking at the screen now and looking at the colorful lines on the graph, bear with me because this is a bit of a struggle for people to appreciate, I think. But in the left-hand square, you see a whole bunch of narrow colored lines down below that are tightly clustered together. That's relating over a 10-year period the risk of having a metastases from local recurrence from your breast cancer. So you can see those lines are all tight together, meaning whether you're heavy or not heavy, it really doesn't make much difference to local recurrence, which is more of a sign of failure of primary therapy. But look at the broader lines, the slightly thicker colored lines above there. This is where the story is. And what it shows is that your chances of having a metastasis, a distant metastasis from your original tumor, are much higher the heavier you are. And there's a gradation. The heavier you are, the more likely your risk. And that gradation is what gives confidence to this study, along with the fact that it was a 10-year study with about 53,000 patients. And similarly, on the right-hand square, same idea, really, except instead of talking about metastasis, it refers to death. But the relationship is the same. If we just look at a measure of insulin resistance, in this particular case, we're looking at, to start with, something called C-peptide, which is a measure of insulin production, which in turn is a measure of insulin resistance. Then there's substantial increases in both all-cause mortality and breast cancer mortality in people who have higher C-peptide levels. I'm not suggesting you go out and ask your doctor to measure that. It's not a terribly helpful additional measurement, but it's a useful data point to know about. And we see that if you have diabetes. If you're diabetes and you're slim, then the problem is actually type 2 diabetes and you're slim, the problem is actually greater. We could talk about why that might be. It's actually greatest when those with estrogen receptor positive tumors. And the first person that ever identified this that I'm aware of was Pam Goodwin, who back in the early 2000s was identifying a substantially higher risk of cancer death from early stage breast cancer in those who had higher insulin levels. If we just look at the diabetes subgroup, very, very similar. Both all-cause and breast cancer-specific mortality seems to be higher. And remembering that most type 2 diabetes is a reversible disease. This isn't something we talk about in our medical culture very much. But if we remember that most cases of type 2 diabetes are a reversible disease, that goes beyond treatable. And I think if any of you or have type 2 diabetes in this audience, wrapping your mind around that concept, it might be the best thing you do for your health long term. And you're the only person in the room that can do it. You're the only person on the planet that can do it. So now we're going to be talking about sugars. And I'm starting with this mouse study. I almost never use animal studies. I think I only have 2 animal studies in this whole talk. But what they looked at was they said, there's all these issues about sugar intake, which we'll touch on very soon, obesity and insulin resistance and cancer in humans. What happens if we take an animal model, a mouse model of breast cancer, so these mice all get breast cancer, and give them sugar? What happens? Well, what they found that happens is their tumors grew more, they metastasized more when they were fed more sugar, and they found a mechanism, the 12-lipoxygenase pathway, to explain why the sugars might turn on this adverse gene. So you say, well, that's mice. Why'd they do the study? They did the study because we've seen this in humans. So multiple studies here showing that women with breast cancer who have more carbohydrates and are chubby tend to develop more breast cancer. Women with breast cancer who eat more carbohydrates tend to have higher recurrence rates to their tumor after primary therapy. And if you eat more for any group of people who eat more carbohydrates, they have more estrogen-negative tumors. And this all applies, incidentally, to the postmenopausal group. These relationships with dietary starches do not apply to the premenopausal group, which is kind of a fascinating issue. So we've talked about weight, we've talked about insulin resistance, and we've talked about dietary sugars and starches. So what's our solution to those 3 issues? First of all, I'm going to make the argument that the smartest choice for insulin resistance is a whole food Mediterranean-style diet, which is kind of a convenient one to follow because it's the most omnivorous. Not only is it the one with best data for improvement, it's also the one that requires the least adjustment to most people's lifestyle. It is not a low-fat diet. It's a good fat diet. I'm going to suggest that we avoid refined grains and sugars and sweet drinks like crazy, or we are crazy. And I'm going to mention why grains themselves, whole grains, are actually really good for you. I'm going to suggest we should schedule daily exercise, that we should lose weight if appropriate, while maintaining muscle mass. And there's only one way to do that. You got to have muscle mass. And in women in particular, they don't start with as much muscle mass. So going through a therapy for their cancer, they've often lost a whole lot of whatever little bit of muscle they started with. So thinking in terms of muscle mass is a really good idea. And in the future, we may have other approaches to improve insulin sensitivity. And metformin has some promising data. Some of the other drugs have promising data. Ketogenic diets might have a role. But so far, those methods haven't worked in other areas. So we have doubts as to whether they'll work out, but we should keep our eyes on them. So if we're going to talk about a whole food Mediterranean diet, what are we talking about? Vegetables, beans and legumes, whole fruit, minimally processed whole grains, and we'll touch on that in more detail. Extra virgin olive oil and raw nuts and seeds. We'll talk more about that, and especially the unique characteristics of extra virgin olive oil compared to other vegetable oils, including unprocessed animal proteins as being perfectly acceptable, including dairy, especially cultured dairy, and the role of alcohol. So if we're going to identify refined carbs, these are, if you only come out with one message out of my talk, I'd really appreciate it that it's this one. Get rid of juices, sweet drinks, refined flours and breads and pastas, ready-to-eat cereals like breakfast cereals, white rice and sugars. Get rid of that, and you've covered 2/3 of the territory, in my opinion. And I often get people who come in, and I saw recently a lady brought in her child, and the child was eating these crackers of some kind, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, they're made of potato starch." Well, potato starch is just straight sugar. There's nothing healthy about it. She said, "Well, they're organic and non-GMO." Organic, non-GMO junk food is still junk food. And the secret here is just don't buy sweet food. If you want sweet food, add the sugars yourself. And if you really need a sweetener, honey, maple syrup, and regular sugar are your best choices, of which honey is probably the smartest choice. Whole grains. We live in an area, Portland has an interesting culture that has a substantial anti-grain element, which I think is really awkward because grains are associated with, including other forms of, so grains by themselves, as well as beans and vegetables, are all associated with lower breast cancer incidence rates and improvement in survival. And hopefully everybody has a handout, but if you feel like going down, looking at the detailed parts of the handout, and look at the degree of benefit, the relative risk reduction that I'm including, and compare it to the relative risk reductions of what we expect to see from radiation chemotherapy, and I think you're going to be saying, and with me, is why don't we make a bigger deal of this? Because these steps, these lifestyle steps, are associated with as good or greater degree of benefit to the patient as are other treatments. I'm not suggesting you don't do the other treatments and do this instead, but realize that this is just as important as your decisions regarding chemotherapy and radiation. The reason we think high-fiber foods may have an element of benefit here is one of the mechanisms is they do reduce insulin resistance. Vegetables and fruit. If we just look at this, so we suggest people have vegetables and fruit with every meal and snack, vegetables or fruit with every meal and snack, including breakfast. And that's because it's associated with improved survival in numerous different studies. And if you actually don't take people's word for it, but measure carotenoids in their blood, which is a measure of what they're taking in forms of fruits and vegetables, you also see a survival benefit. And these survival benefits are in the 40 to 60% region. These are huge benefits. So if we're going to look at the Mediterranean diet in this whole context of weight, breast cancer, insulin resistance, and say, where does this breast cancer Mediterranean diet link come in? Well, first of all, people who follow the Mediterranean diet tend to be healthier. Less cancer, less total mortality, less neurodegenerative disease such as dementia, less heart attack and stroke, less depression, and less disability in elderly. That's all good. If we just look at the breast cancer data, epidemiologically, substantially less breast cancer in areas that follow the Mediterranean diet. And if you look in US data or European data, for every gradation of adherence to the Mediterranean style diet, you see less incidence of breast cancer as well as total mortality. If you just look at randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet in cancer, the first study that looked at this was the Lyon Heart study, and they found a 60% reduction in all cancers after 4 years. in those following a Mediterranean-style diet compared to those following a prudent low-fat diet. So this was not a group following Mediterranean diet compared to a group following a really lousy diet. This was groups following two smart diets, engineered ethically by good people. And those on the Mediterranean diet did substantially better. Recently, just in the last few months ago, the PREDIMED group published their analysis. So this was a pre-specified analysis in the PREDIMED study, which involved a total of about 7,000 people randomized to a prudent low-fat diet or a Mediterranean-style diet with extra olive oil or nuts as extra forms of fat. And they found a 68% lower risk of breast cancer in the group on the Mediterranean diet with extra olive oil. By extra olive oil, these were in-your-face investigators. By extra olive oil, they gave everybody a liter of olive oil a week. If used, that's 1,200 calories a day. So this was not a low-fat diet by any stretch of the imagination. So why might the Mediterranean diet work for breast cancer? It might work because the Mediterranean diet is associated with less metabolic syndrome, which is another word for insulin resistance. It's associated with less type 2 diabetes. And it's associated with it's one of the only diets that's ever been shown to reverse diabetes. Without weight loss, without activity, if you just go on a Mediterranean diet, they have significant rates of reversal of type 2 diabetes. The other part is that this olive oil thing. So looking down at the second bullet on this slide, then the olive oil has been associated with reduced cancer for a long time, and we'll look at that in the next slide. And so what they did in this study on the second bullet is they compared olive oil to corn oil in a rat model of breast cancer. And they found that those on the corn oil compared to those on the olive oil had developed more breast cancers and tended to be chubbier despite the same number of calories, which is a really fascinating aspect of olive oil on metabolism. And the other problem is people often don't realize that your standard vegetable oils, corn, safflower, canola, soy, whatever, are all incredibly highly processed foods as you buy them in the store. Because they're not really highly processed, they're really inedible. If any of you haven't ever tasted some unrefined canola oil, it's sort of like liquid turnips. And I'm not really exaggerating that much. That's why it's inedible. And so they have to so they press this stuff cold, right? You see it says cold pressed on the label. And then if you phone up the company and say, well, how hot does it actually get during processing? Well, that's going to be anywhere from 250 degrees Fahrenheit to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a long way from cold pressed. If you stick your arm in that stuff, you'd lose it. Or at least the skin off it, because hopefully you'd pull you've heard of boiling oil? That's how it's processed. So this is a really interesting analysis of 23 studies of olive oil consumption in different populations and looking at cancer risk reduction. And it's a complex slide in one sense. It's not complex in another. What it shows is that for almost every cancer, in every single study that's looked at this, that's of any quality at all, looking at almost every cancer, shows a reduction in risk that averages about 40% in people who eat the most olive oil compared to those who eat the least. And extra virgin olive oil appeared to be associated with the greatest benefit. I'm just going to take a slurp. Any questions at this point? We have a question. So the question is, if weight gain is associated with more postmenopausal recurrence and death, why do so many of our treatments predispose to weight gain? It's because those treatments work, and the risk is better than the benefit is greater than the risk. And that's really the standard answer throughout all of medicine. If somebody comes in with a pneumonia, I see him for a simple thing like a pneumonia, and I give him an antibiotic, I might kill him with that antibiotic. I'm more likely to save their life. So that's the basic issue. So what you've got to do is look at the treatments, realize the potential complications, and work like crazy to reverse those complications. So I use steroids in my practice all the time, as you'd expect. We also do our best to build up people's muscle mass, reduce their calorie intake, especially their starch calorie intake, and maintain their protein and good fat intake throughout therapy, and that's the key, I think, is to realize these treatments are not safe, but they're safer than no treatment. Did I answer your question? Okay, moving on. Omega-3 fats in general, there's soft but persistent data showing benefits. And so we think of these as the oily fish, which are probably the most benefit, and then the oil seeds. And the ones I think are most notable are the tree nuts, especially walnuts, and flax seeds. And we'll talk about that. But I'd like to also point out there's actually excellent evidence that sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds, those green pumpkin seeds, pepitas, are associated with quite striking benefits for breast cancer also. Now we're going to move on to activity. So this is one of my favorite slides. Those of you who had suffered through my talks before might have seen this slide before because I find it hard not to use it. So this is an 88-year-old patient who celebrated his 88th birthday with a 15K fun run. That's an attitude. If we look at exercise, it does a real number on insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So for example, people who exercise every day, they cut their risk of developing diabetes or insulin resistance by somewhere in the region of half, right out of the chute, no matter what other decisions they make in their life. Tons of benefits of regular exercise, including reduction in total mortality. Exercise is your number one anti-inflammatory agent. It's your number one antioxidant. Exercise is an amazing tool. So what about exercise for the breast cancer survivor? It improves cancer-related and overall survival. It allows people to go through therapy and not gain weight. It improves quality of life. So women going through cancer therapy who exercise have better function, as you might expect, but they've also got better mood, better sleep, and more energy. It improves insulin resistance, which may be a key factor as to how exercise works. And so we suggest that people exercise for at least 30 minutes or more on days ending in Y, but only those days. So just before we move on to the last part of the talk, I'm going to make the case that there's strong and plausible associations. In other words, not only epidemiologic, but also randomized controlled trials and modeling data using biochemical models all suggest that there's a strong association between obesity, refined carbohydrates, sedentary behavior, and your cancer. Whether you get it, whether you successfully treat it, whether it comes back. It also is, those things are also strongly associated with whether you're going to get something else prematurely. We're all going to die of something. But most breast cancer patients get heart disease, for example. And so anything we do for breast cancer, we should also be thinking about how do we prevent heart disease in this patient. And so we really should be pursuing effective programs to promote prudent diets, exercise, maintaining muscle mass, and loss of visceral fat. Visceral fat's the stuff around your belly. It would be a loose way of looking at that. Are likely to do at least as much as most of our other treatments, except for the surgeons. We think the surgeons are still better than the lifestyle guys at cancer. So now I could take another question or two if you want. I apologize, can you start again?
In the mornings, I usually have blueberries, which are supposed to be high in antioxidants, and then I sprinkle like chia and flaxseed across it. But recently I found out that flaxseed promotes estrogen, and if your cancer is estrogen receptive, should you be using flaxseed?
And we will touch on that. So we're going to be talking about flaxseed in just a second. Any other questions? So the question is coconut oil. I can't find any reasonable data on coconut oil. The good part of coconut oil is it's been around since the entire recorded history of mankind. So that's always a good sign. I'm not aware of any outcomes data of any significance. So we aren't big promoters of coconut oil, but we think that time may show it to be a perfectly reasonable oil. It's a far cry from your highly processed vegetable oils. And of course I'm biased. I don't particularly like this stuff, so that doesn't help. Hormone-free meats or dairy, I don't know that there's any basis for thinking that it actually makes any difference.
Cold pressed extra virgin olive oil, is that?
Well, extra virgin olive oil, by definition, has to be cold pressed. By definition, you're not allowed to press it at more than 80 degrees. In other words, they can't even press that stuff on a hot day. So if it says extra virgin and it's true extra virgin, and so we'd recommend, we talk about a bit about this in our book, get domestic olive oils. And around here there's Red Ridge Farms, otherwise known as Oregon Olive Mill, great source. California Olive Ranch, Cordo, these are all great sources of olive oil. We're talking about anything that gets you short of breath and sweaty every day. We don't think you can make a strong distinction between exercises, but we suspect in our society, where even moderate exercise really isn't much compared to what humans have done historically, that some kind of weights, for you that actually may be just swinging a shovel in your backyard or something like that, but something that builds muscle is probably going to be found to be critical, is our suspicion. But taking a walk is not a bad step. Taking stairs is even better. We're going to talk about some other things. Soy. I should have done a quick pre-talk survey on how many people thought that soy was bad for you. So to us, soy is just another bean. Beans are good for you. Soy is good for you. But let's look at soy and breast cancer because of this phytoestrogen issue. So the reason why this is such a big deal in a lot of people's minds is because a lot of foods such as flax and soy have these compounds that act kind of like estrogen in the body. The thing is, whenever you hear that word, you should also ask the person who's telling you, do they also act like anti-estrogens? Because they do. Biochemical constructs are never simple. And if you ever hear somebody giving you a simple biochemical construct, they either are lying or they don't, or they're ignorant. Those are your two possibilities. Not that I'm opinionated on this or anything. So you always have to ask, do we have data that shows what happens when people eat soy foods? Now, we don't have randomized controlled trials of any significance, but we do have lots and lots of associations. So the first bullet there here on the screen is looking at a meta-analysis of studies enrolling, high-quality studies enrolling 11,000 women with breast cancer and looking at their use of soy foods. And a diet high in soy was found to have be associated with a 20% decrease in their risk of their breast cancer recurring, and a 15% decrease, both significant, in their chance of dying of any cause. And what's interesting is the benefit actually appeared to be greater in those with estrogen receptor negative tumors than positive, which should add to our questions as to how in the world is this working. So we think that women with cancer should actually be encouraged to use soy foods. In our book, there's a really delicious, because I don't particularly like soy, but I tell you what, Mia's recipe with marinated tofu is outstanding. Even I can like soy. In this slide, we talk a little bit about types of traditional soy foods to eat. We suggest avoiding any kind of highly processed soy foods or extract. So nothing I say about soy should be taken to, oh, I'm going to go get a powder made of soy, or something like that. Soy milk, we can't see a really strong place for. It's really a highly processed food where the best parts of the food are thrown away or given to pigs or something. That makes no sense to us. Other beans and legumes are probably as valuable, we suspect. And it's interesting, if you look at the epidemiologic studies, things like sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds work just as well as soy. So if you don't want to eat soy, then there's lots of other good foods out there. Now we're going to talk about alcohol. So the risk of breast cancer increases proportional to intake with alcohol. The increase is not huge, but it's there. So you might say, oh, I better not eat alcohol, drink alcohol. But, what about the health benefits of moderate alcohol, which are associated with lower all-cause mortality, primarily through its effect on diabetes, reducing your risk of diabetes and improving diabetes control, and reducing your risk of heart attack and stroke. So, it even reduces your risk of dementia and diabetes. How's that? So you got these potential harms, and then you've got these potential benefits. And what do we mean? So we're going to be talking about moderate alcohol, and for moderate alcohol, we're talking basically about a 5-ounce glass of wine a day. And I'm just in the interest of time, I'm going to move past this one. For those of you who say, but I keep hearing that alcohol causes cancer, here's the basic data. This is about a study involving about 130,000 people, and indeed, at high levels, it does increase cancer, a very, very small amount. Whether that's clinically significant is a very reasonable question. So now let's just look at, this talk is about survivorship. Let's look at what happens when a breast cancer patient drinks alcohol. So this is a study with about 23,000 women with invasive breast cancer, followed for 11 years. I think you'd agree that the sample size is adequate and the length of follow-up is adequate. And those that drank alcohol had 36% lower all-cause mortality. So if we're going to look at the nifty little editorial that came with this paper, this is by DeMark, Winifred, and Goodwin. So these are Pam Goodwin. These are two of leading investigators of breast cancer that have been notable in the field for about 20 years. And they say, based on the best available evidence, it appears that modest alcohol consumption after breast cancer diagnosis, up to approximately 1 drink per day on average, may be associated with optimal overall survival. Optimal overall survival, isn't that what we're looking for? And people are happier too. Flax seeds. So the background of flax seeds is that people who eat more lignans, which are one of the components of flax seeds, have less postmenopausal breast cancer. So a bunch of people did studies, of which I've mentioned this one here, which is the notable one in the second bullet, that women who ate about 25 grams of flax seeds a day in the form of a muffin had reduced tumor growth. Nobody's ever done a long-term study on this. But the epidemiology and the data from intervention studies, short-term intervention studies, all suggest that flax seeds and probably other sources of lignans are beneficial for you. So we still promote the use of flaxseed meal in our patients. Some ideas about how to use it are in this slide, and we would suggest that sesame seeds may have similar benefit. They also are very rich in lignans, and there's strong epidemiologic data supporting those as well. So you don't have to have flax. And now we're going to move on to dairy. So there's another perception that I noticed that seems to me to be kind of a Portland thing, and that is dairy kills you, and in particular, dairy is associated with more breast cancer. And I don't know where that comes from. If you look at dairy consumption, it's probably associated with lower risk of total mortality in most studies. It's associated with lower risk of breast cancer. It's associated with less diabetes and less obesity, and it's anti-inflammatory. Hardly a day goes by in my practice where somebody doesn't come in and tell me that dairy is inflammatory. And I can't find any data supporting that. There's 8 good quality studies on the subject. Not a single one of them showed dairy to be inflammatory. So next time you have somebody say that, ask them why. I've never seen any support for that. But most of the dairy, all the dairy I buy in the Portland area always seems to be RBST free anyway. So in Portland, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
Right, in Portland, but it's not like that.
But I'm not aware of any supporting evidence for that. For example, if you took a RBST milk and analyze it compared to a non-RBST milk, I don't think you can find a difference. But if anybody has that data to the contrary, we'd love to hear about it. So yeah, so the one of the things that we think is interesting about that's sort of a constant thread throughout the dairy literature is that people who have cultured dairy seem to do better. And traditionally, that was a predominant form of dairy intake. So yogurt, kefir, and cheese, we would suggest, probably makes more sense than just drinking a lot of milk. Another thing to know about it, when you read studies, for example, there's a study with the first author, Krunke, that says that high-fat dairy is associated with more breast cancer. So you leaf through the study, and you find out what they define as high-fat dairy. It's ice cream, puddings, and flans, whatever flans are. And to me, that's not a very helpful piece of data because we also know that sugar is associated with more breast cancer. Vitamin D. Watch out for vitamin D. It's really a fantastic example of how little we know about nutrition. So high levels of vitamin D are associated with more harm, and low levels are associated with more harm, including breast cancer risk. So what we want to do is be somewhere in between, and so far we really haven't seen that vitamin D helps with, like a lot of us were thinking it might help with aromatase inhibitor pain. Now I still use it for that, but the data suggests it probably doesn't work for that. And vitamin D supplements haven't done much in their studies. So what we're suggesting is use vitamin D supplements if necessary, to get your level between 20 and 40 nanograms per mil, which is lower than we've historically looked for. And remember the other forms of vitamin D, which is things like non-burning sunlight, light-exposed mushrooms, and oily fish. Vegetarian and vegan diets. Oh, Loch, you're here. Sorry. I'm going overtime because I didn't realize Loch was here. So.
And Dr. Hassell, we have a couple questions from our satellite stations in Bend and Roseburg. That we
Okay, shoot.
Okay, this one is coming from Roseburg. Is there a role for anti-inflammatory diet, greens, beans, in mitigating fatigue and other side effects of radiation?
Absolutely. So any diet that's Mediterranean, that's weight loss, and involves exercise is an anti-inflammatory diet. So the diet that's most commonly promoted, at least in Portland, as an anti-inflammatory diet actually is not. For example, any diet that excludes dairy products is not making an attempt to be an anti-inflammatory diet. So I think part of the problem that everybody needs to do is step back from the word anti-inflammatory diet and say, what is an anti-inflammatory diet? Because any weight loss diet is anti-inflammatory, exercise is anti-inflammatory, and the Mediterranean diet has been consistently associated with being anti-inflammatory, and in head-to-head studies against other diets actually has a better anti-inflammatory effect. So the big issue there is define your anti-inflammatory diet, but in terms of how the question is questioned, absolutely, the anti-inflammatory diet is important. Did I manage to confuse that?
She hasn't answered, so
Okay.
she's in Bend.
Okay.
One more, and this one's from Roseburg, and it said, did you say that most breast cancer patients get heart disease? If so, what did you mean? Please explain.
So I should refine that a little bit. So a breast cancer patient is more likely to die of heart attack than they are to die of their breast cancer. That's what I mean.
Thank you.
All right, vegetarian vegan diets, nowhere near the kind of data we have for Mediterranean diets. You'll notice the absence of randomized controlled trials. And because I keep getting questions about the China study and forks over knives, I've given a great little a blog post there that's an outstanding analysis of both those subjects. But I can't see any evidence that suggests that a vegetarian or vegan diet is better than the Mediterranean diet on any level whatsoever. And in the only head-to-head trials that there are between them, which is with diabetes, the Mediterranean diet was clearly superior. Paleolithic diets, they're kind of a fun idea, but they get rid of all these foods that are good for you, including alcohol and dairy, and you can imagine how upset I am about that. So we don't have any decent studies that tell us that Paleolithic diets are better. We don't even have any decent basis on which to say what a Paleolithic diet was. We even have trouble defining who Paleolithic people were. And then if we start asking questions like, were they healthy? Because there's lots of hunter-gatherer populations throughout the world that just have horrible health that we don't want to copy. So interesting idea. We'll see if it actually ends up being anything. So we think we should minimize sugars and other forms of starches, especially refined flours, that we should eat a whole food Mediterranean-style diet with good fat, unprocessed animal protein, and intact grains, that we should include moderate alcohol if there's not a reason to avoid alcohol, of which there's many, of course. Daily exercise is critical, and avoiding sitting. We don't have time to go into it, but avoid sitting for anything more than about an hour. So as soon as Loch's finished talking, you better get up. And then there might be other mechanisms we use in the future. We have a website that has some free handouts that you might find useful. Over to Loch.
And I forgot to mention, we will have some time for questions at the end, although we've gone a little freeform here. Dr. Loch Chandler is joining us, fresh off of teaching courses this morning. He is a naturopathic physician and licensed acupuncturist. He is currently the medical director of the Providence Integrative Medicine Group. He received his doctorate from the National College of Natural Medicine, has a Master's of Science in Oriental Medicine, and a Master's of Public Administration with a focus in health administration. Let me see. Let me have them.
this the slide advance? Yeah, all right. All right. Whew, after driving through the traffic of Portland. So we're going to talk a little bit more about acupuncture today, just to tail into what Miles was talking about. And so our discussion today, we're going to talk a little bit about how acupuncture can help, because we often don't talk about this aspect of care. And so certainly there are supplements that we can do for some of the side effects of treatment, and as we move beyond treatment and even during treatment, but we're going to go a little bit more into the details. So who here has had acupuncture? Who here, maybe I should ask, who here hasn't had acupuncture? I think the haven'ts has sort of, there's more people who have received acupuncture. So if you haven't had acupuncture, it's very thin stainless steel needles that are about as thick as your hair, so it shouldn't hurt as it's going into your skin. The worst it should feel, as I explain it to patients, if somebody took a small hair, gave it a slight tug, it may pinch like that. But what we're doing in Chinese medicine is a little bit different. So it grew around in the United States when Nixon went to China, and one of the New York Times writers got an appendicitis and he had pain, and then he did acupuncture and it got better, and he wrote about it, and people were like, what is this acupuncture thing? But then, would you think that most of the data with acupuncture is from China? Or the earliest that we have evidence of acupuncture would be in China? I mean, you would think that the earliest evidence for acupuncture would be in China. Actually, it was with the discovery of the Iceman in the early 1990s in the Austrian Alps. They found this gentleman who was in a glacier, but he had these tattoos on acupuncture points that correlated with back pain. And when they did an x-ray, they found that he had terrible back health. And so that was about 5,000 years ago for him. So the earliest evidence is actually in Italy. A lot of what we do with acupuncture is for pain. That's where most of the data is. And if you've done it through treatment, oftentimes you'll do it for nausea or fatigue or neuropathy, some of the numbness and tingling that can happen with some of the treatments. But we also do it for some of the hot flashes and aches and pains that can happen with some of the aromatase inhibitors or tamoxifen. So you can see from the scientific method, we always have two ways of explaining acupuncture. One would be from Western medicine, the other would be from Chinese medicine. In Western medicine, we say that when I put a needle into your skin, it releases the body's natural painkillers, the endorphins. So that's how it can help with pain, but also helps with serotonin and dopamine. So it can help with relaxation, and most people notice being relaxed after acupuncture. Chinese medicine, though, is going to describe it a little bit differently. It's going to say when we're in balance, and what they say with balance, it's going to be the organs of Chinese medicine. They talk about the spleen, the liver, the heart, the lung, and the kidney. And when you feel pulses in Chinese medicine, that's what we're feeling. What pulses are low that we need to help strengthen? What pulses are high that we need to help bring down? Because where we have balance, we have health. And so what we talk about with the Zhongdao, that's that balanced state, is that internal environment. And so what Miles talked about is what can we do to optimize that internal environment? Because that's a pivotal piece for our health. It helps us retain or attain balance and maintain. But with acupuncture, that energy flows in channels. And so this picture has some of those channels on us, and that's what we're using the needles on, is to help optimize the flow of qi. And again, influenced by the diet. But that's where we can have things like imbalance. That's where we have things such as cancer. But it would be heart disease, knee pain, neck pain, high blood pressure, cancer. Chinese medicine would say those aren't problems, those are symptoms of problems. So how can we help the body get back into balance so that downstream impact is different than what we have? This is just an example of a perspective. Chinese medicine is going to be viewed as the body as the internal environment as a garden. And oftentimes in Western medicine, we see it more as a machine. If my knee is bad, I might get a new knee. Or if I have maybe kidney cancer, maybe I have 2 kidneys, so I'll get one taken out. But that's what we're trying to do in Chinese medicine, is to optimize that internal environment. And with what we just heard with Miles' talk, optimizing that internal environment with diet and food. And that's going to help us in the long run. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. In Chinese medicine, we always say to treat the branch, we treat the root. So if cancer is the branch, we want to go upstream and treat the root of the cause. And that's oftentimes working with diet, lifestyle, exercise, using things like acupuncture, Tai Chi, Qigong, relationships, mental, emotional, spiritual health. We're talking about the root causes. When we think of the word healing, that's often, or health, it's often whole. The root word of health is wholeness. And so what is it that makes us whole? And in Chinese medicine, we're just adding that different philosophy. So we're going to move just a little bit quicker so we can have time for Q&A. Those are needles. What we say with acupuncture, research is hard. Now, if some of you have had acupuncture, you would probably know if I didn't put a needle into your skin, correct? It's kind of hard to differentiate. Usually you know if I've had a needle, but when they do sham studies, oftentimes they maybe pretend to do a needle, but people often notice that. But sometimes they do needles in different parts where they think it's not associated. But as we just mentioned, that acupuncture often releases chemicals. So no matter if you put a needle in the spot where it's supposed to be or a sham point an inch away, we're still going to release chemicals that then will affect parts of the body and have an impact. So it's very hard to do a sham study. This is an example of it. So this is after an acupuncture treatment. They did an MRI of the brain to see what is the impact of that needle on the brain. And you can see that on the left-hand side, there's the sham needle. And on the right-hand side, there's the real needle. What do you guys notice as the difference? Anybody want to take a gander? So they look kind of similar, don't they? And so that's the bottom line, is oftentimes when we're going to put a needle into the skin, it's going to release the chemicals that cause an impact. So this is just giving you an example of, yeah, sham needle studies, you know, if they're using needles into the skin, it's going to release chemicals and have an impact also. Oftentimes what you find, it's less of an impact, but it's still an impact. We're going to cover a couple studies that go into that. So really, when we think about acupuncture and nausea, so how many of you had acupuncture for nausea? Did it help? Yes is the response. Okay. So that's most of the data that we have with regards to acupuncture is with nausea and vomiting. And so, but what they do it with is oftentimes chemotherapy, pregnancy, or surgery associated. So from the anesthesia that they do. And what they found is it's effective. So that's the summary from these slides. You can do acupressure too. So how many of you had C-bands? Maybe those motion sickness bands that you can get, the elastic bands with the button. Did people try that? I recommend it for a lot of my patients. And so this study is just saying that, hey, people who did the C-bands had less nausea, less vomiting. And so it's one of those things that you can purchase at a Rite Aid or a Walgreens. And it's done on the most studied point here, which is pericardium 6, which is right there. We have 2 of them. It's on the inside of the wrist. It's about 2 inches up from the wrist crease towards your elbow between the 2 main tendons on your wrist. So if you want to try and find it, you just go up towards the elbow, right between those 2 tendons, and it sort of sinks in. If you're going up with a little bit of pressure where it sinks into a little hollow, that's pericardium 6. You can go on one side or another. That's the nausea point that has been studied. So now you guys know how to do it. And so you can press that on and off or just hold it, and the recommendation is for a minute, about every hour or so, or as needed for nausea and vomiting. There's also a little party trick with this point. It's for hiccups. It works about 75% of the time. So just FYI, sometimes that will come in handy. So this is a case of mine that I had. A 72-year-old female came in to see me, and she was having chronic nausea. She had breast cancer, and she had 1 round of chemotherapy, but she had to stop because she was nauseous after that. Every day she would be nauseous, and it was hard for her to eat, and she was losing weight. And so we did some of the acupuncture points that we just talked about on pericardium 6. And I gave a couple other things, but in a couple weeks, her nausea was gone. And so usually I don't think it's a silver bullet, more of silver buckshot, so it's probably the acupuncture plus the other things that we are doing. But that's an example of how acupuncture can be effective. This is talking about electroacupuncture and women with breast cancer getting chemotherapy. And so this is where we hook up the electrics. The summary of this was that helped to reduce the nausea in this patient population. So again, you have the data and information. I'm just going to summarize them just to go through and make sure we have enough time for questions so you guys can walk away with some of your concerns. Ginger. Did you guys try ginger too? Yeah, occasionally I do that now. I mean, if I'm feeling a little queasy in my stomach, a little nausea, I'm going to do a little ginger, and I find that that helps. And so this is just a study saying that that can be helpful too. What they did was with more of powdered ginger as opposed to a ginger chew. We usually say what forms of ginger you like to do, whether that's a tea or a chew or a mint, something that has that ginger quality. Chemotherapy fatigue. How many people had that or still have it? Not many? That's pretty good. Some, okay, a few more hands go up. It's like, all right, I'll raise my hand. So what this study did is looked at acupuncture on the impact of fatigue, and they did 6 or 8 treatments, and they found that the fatigue reduced on average about 30%. So it's just another tool for you to think about, wow, if I'm still having fatigue, maybe acupuncture could be one of those things that we give a try. This is just another one, and the fatigue score reduced. What you'll see down towards the bottom bullets is you'll see other areas where it helps. And so you can see that acupuncture is not only for fatigue, but it can be for the anxiety and depression and quality of life. We often see that with acupuncture, that it's not just for what we're studying, but we see other areas where it can be helpful. And so helping with moods, helping with sleep, helping reduce depression, which a lot of us go through at different points in our life. This was another case study, a 43-year-old female. She had stage 4 breast cancer, and she was getting chemotherapy, and she was getting ready for Race for the Cure. And her family was coming in from out of town, and she was like, okay, what can you do to help me with my energy? Because it's a big weekend, and I'm going to be out and about and doing things. I want to make sure that I can do that with my friends and my family. And so I actually went in with her, and I gave her infusion acupuncture. So when she was getting getting infused in her doctor's office, I went and gave her acupuncture at the same time. And so what she noticed was that she was able to do the walk of the Race for the Cure and be with her friends and family that weekend, more so in a way than she had when I hadn't given her acupuncture in the infusion center. So she noticed more energy and endurance over that weekend. Acupuncture and radiation fatigue. This is a big one because oftentimes we see fatigue with radiation. And doing those things that Miles mentioned about what are the optimal diet, the fruits, the vegetables, the nutrients that can help us repair and recover. Protein is certainly an important piece of that. But this is just an example of how acupuncture can be helpful. Hot flashes. Probably, I should just skip over this one. Probably not a big issue. So what you can see here is that this group of women with breast cancer, a randomized trial, 2 acupuncture treatments a week for 4 weeks. And you can see that their number of hot flashes reduced from 8.6 in the acupuncture group and from 10 to 7 in the sham group. So the summary of the statement was like, sham study, acupuncture doesn't seem to really be effective for hot flashes. But if we go back to that earlier slide about the MRI, what we know is that the sham study was also effective too. We can say that both were effective for hot flashes. And the sham point that they used, the fake point, was about 1 inch away. So not too far in regards to acupuncture. So then again, just going back to that MRI that we looked at before. This is just another acupuncture study compared to Effexor. And so what you can see is that that when they stopped the treatment, that the Effexor group noticed an increase in their hot flashes where the acupuncture didn't. Again, this is more for information. You can go back to it and look. That's another one that goes into that. This is the body aches and pains and acupuncture, and the summary is that acupuncture can also help reduce some of the aches and pains from the aromatase inhibitors. So a lot of my patients are going to come in and just say, yeah, I'm just having my elbows are a little bit more sore today. Maybe the next time it's the knees or the hips, and then doing acupuncture to help alleviate that. So again, you have all this information. So this is acupuncture and pain. As I mentioned, one of the chief areas, pain is big with acupuncture, and releasing those endorphins and kephalins, the body's natural painkillers, we're going to see a reduction with pain. This was a study that came out just a couple years ago, just looking at thousands of people saying that, yeah, acupuncture seems to do a pretty good job with pain. Acupuncture and neuropathy. I like this study, even though it was a small study, just only 18 people. And you can see that it was just a few years ago. They got 1 session a week for 6 weeks, and they improved symptoms, about 82%. This was another study that I liked even better, but it was smaller, 6 patients. But what they did was a nerve conduction study. So oftentimes when we do studies, sometimes we're just going to ask the patient how they feel. So this is where they do a nerve conduction to see actually how is that nerve functioning. So it's hard to be subjective about that, because it's going to give you data. And what they notice is, even though it was a small group, they noticed the nerve conduction improved. So this was the first time that they found that, wow, acupuncture can really change the dynamic for neuropathy. So over the years, I've worked out a neuropathy protocol that has worked fairly well for most of my patients. Patients ask me, well, what's your success rate? I was like, well, usually I find that it helps. It's just a matter of how much it helps. And so oftentimes that's going to be dictated by when they come in. How long have they had it? they come in during their treatments that may cause neuropathy, or is it 2 years later? But I would say that oftentimes, again, it's going to help. This is just talking about insomnia, and acupuncture can be helpful for insomnia, so if you're having difficulty sleeping. And again, it's not to say instead of, oftentimes it's about options. And just giving people options. Man, I've tried some of those things and they just didn't work for me. Is there something else that could be helpful? Anxiety and depression. Lymphedema. So as I was looking just over the recent research, this was a pilot study of 37 women with breast cancer. And what they noticed is they did acupuncture 2 times a week for 4 weeks, so 8 treatments total, and they did the affected side. So oftentimes, when I first got out of school 16 years ago, the idea was, okay, don't do acupuncture in the limb that's maybe potentially affected or is affected by lymphedema. And so I always wondered, because at the time I didn't have any data to go by to say, well, I can't find anything that says this is harmful. And at the time I was giving another talk at another conference, and there was an occupational therapist named Gwen White. She's written a book on lymphedema. And she knew my dad because she worked at Kaiser, and so I went up and introduced myself since we were at the same conference, and I said, Gwen, I have patients coming in saying, hey, don't do needles in the affected limb, and since you wrote this book, what have you found on sort of acupuncture and lymphedema? She's like, I only find that it helps. I was like, me too. And so this was a study that came out just a year or 2 ago, and it shows that they did acupuncture on the affected side and they noticed an improvement in the lymphedema. And so I think that helps getting more data to say that it could be helpful. And one of the points of this study was that it was done by Barry Castleth out of Memorial Sloan Kettering, so she's been around the field for a long time of integrative medicine. And their focus was actually not really on the improvement for lymphedema, but more on the safety piece. So do we see more infections? And they didn't. And so, but they also saw that there was help. Sometimes we talk about selenium for that. As Miles would talk about, we often go with food first. So you can get selenium in Brazil nuts, and that has been found to help with lymphedema too. So getting a healthy fat, a good nut, and some protein can be helpful with that. I often get questions about weight loss. What can acupuncture do for weight loss? Just because typically people see some weight gain over the course of their treatment. This was a study of about 60 people. They were just overweight versus perimenopausal, or around menopause and overweight. And they're given 5 electric acupuncture, so with the electric current, and also some acupuncture ear seeds in their ear. And they got a total of 15 treatments. So they would get basically daily treatment for a week, and then have a couple weeks off, and then repeat it. They measured those parameters, so body weight, their body mass index, waist to hip ratio. And what they found is that those things decreased over time with both groups, but the perimenopausal group just took another cycle. And so the perimenopausal group was a little bit slower to respond, but they also responded in the same way. And so they noticed lower body weight, lower body mass index, waist to hip ratios. And so I thought that this was a pretty good study for supporting that, yeah, acupuncture could be a tool if people are wanting to help support losing weight. And so it can work with things. Oftentimes what they talk about is sort of the craving piece, just relaxation and stress, because oftentimes people are stress eating, and so doing things to help reduce that. Okay, and just recently, we started an infusion acupuncture program at Providence St. Vincent's Hospital. I wrote a small study where we can start to show what is the impact of, because of that the one patient that I gave you that example of, what can we do to help support our patients going through infusion, to help them go through better, to maybe it's not going to be as fatiguing for them, or maybe not cause as much fatigue or nausea or anxiety or neuropathy. Are there ways that we can reduce that and help them overall? So we started it last October, and we've been at St. Vincent's on Fridays, and I supervise a group of students from the naturopathic school, and we're there from basically 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock giving patients acupuncture. And so that's been nice for me, and we're collecting data. We give them surveys every time that they come in, and we're finding out, how is it helping you? And so the results have been pretty good. We're going to start getting some of that information out, but that's been something that has been fun for me to do. And the nice thing is that there's no charge. So we have it underwritten by a generous donation from the Zidell family, and so it's been nice to be able to do that for them. And we've also, one of the side benefits, I wrote it for caregivers. And so caregivers in Providence, we often call the healthcare workers caregivers. So we give it to the nurses and the staff there who are maybe having some pains or discomforts. And so also caregivers meaning friends and family. So if somebody was there with one of their loved ones and they wanted to try acupuncture, we do that too. So I am almost right on time.
Well done. Hello? Yeah, I would like to say one thing about that study, having watched it happen, is that now everybody wants their treatment on Friday. We have time for question and answers. Does anybody have they written things, or do you just want to go with a mic? Because I can chase it around if you can't speak loud enough.
Miles, might need you up here too.
This is being simulcast, so if you can repeat the question, that's great.
Yeah, so how many things can we treat at one time with acupuncture? Is this picking up? Okay, just didn't know if I dropped it in. And so we're not going to separate sort of, well, you have knee pain, so we'll do knee pain. Why don't you come back in a day or two, we'll treat the nausea. So whenever somebody comes in, we're looking at them as a whole person. So oftentimes it's going to be multifactorial. So it's going to be for fatigue, it's going to be for stress, maybe a little nausea, maybe a little neuropathy. So it just really depends. So we don't isolate and segmentize treatments. Question in the back. That's a great question. We often get that. And so what I often say is it's best to have your insurance company find out, does it cover acupuncture? But oftentimes we have financial coordinators who also check for you. So if you wanted to just give your information to one of our financial coordinators, they could vet sort of what your insurance company covers, and then you would know.
Any other questions?
I got Miles up here too. Yes.
So the only grains that have gluten are rye, barley, and wheat. So everything else is okay. Probably for me, it'd be whole oats and things like quinoa, in limited quantities, conceivably brown rice. And I would probably lean much more to the beans, the legume family, and probably use less grain overall just because I like wheat, rye, and barley. Fortunately, I don't have to worry about it. So.
Yeah, sometimes you have to be careful with the gluten-free products because it can have actually a higher glycemic index. And so the whole grains, as Miles mentioned, it's much better to go with that. Well, that's a great question, and oftentimes I recommend just talking with your oncologist and saying, you know, what should I be looking at this again, and maybe trying some other things to see if that can help me maintain use. I mean, that's generally what I would go by, is just think about, could acupuncture be a tool that could help you, but have that conversation with your physician.
Got a question back here, but once again, we're going to ask you to repeat the question since it's
sorry,
simulcast.
sorry.
But that's okay, right here.
Are there any good pastas that we can eat?
So things like brown rice pasta and any of the whole grain pastas, there's a couple of problems with them. One is it's awfully easy to eat too much of them. So if you have a need to restrict your calories, then restricting anything made with flour is a really good step. However, things like brown rice pasta, which would be my favorite pasta, in small quantities, I think makes a tremendous amount of sense. But that's reflecting my bias. I don't like the whole wheat pastas. So So almost anything that's whole grain is probably reasonable if it's minimally processed and the quantity that you eat is thoughtful in relationship to your waistline. And instantly the question was, are there any good pastas to eat? I forgot to repeat the question, sorry.
I was just gonna say you can make spaghetti squash, spaghetti, and then also you can make. There's a recipe to make cauliflower rice, which is really yummy, and you just chop it up really small, and it becomes kind of rice.
So just one of the responses about cauliflower rice was another option, and squash pasta.
Yeah, spaghetti.
There were options for that too.
Or zucchini pasta.
Or zucchini pasta. We're just getting additions here.
Yeah, so the idea of using a spiralizer and putting things like zucchini through it really works well for a lot of people. It's still not like white pasta, I gotta tell you.
But if you've ever had I've tried the cauliflower rice, and it's hard to tell the difference. I mean, so it is tasty. And you got to prove to eat cheese, so you got that on top of that cauliflower rice.
We have
All
a
right.
question back here from someone who wants to know what the ketogenic diet is about.
The ketogenic diet is a gigantic topic that involves a lot of biochemistry, but basically involves severe carbohydrate reduction, and really that puts your body into what arguably could be called a mildly toxic state. And that changes all kinds of biochemical parameters and may have a role. It's been studied for a long time. It's so far not been shown to do much in most applications. But it's one of those very, very interesting areas that I think at least deserves to be noticed because people are doing a lot of work on it. I hope that's enough of an answer.
Did that answer your question enough? Okay.
I don't think, to add on to that, I don't think we have enough data to really say it's in regard to cancer. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's one sort of promising study on glioblastoma, but it's tiny. And remember, this is you could reasonably call this a mildly toxic state. There's a lot of reasons why it may not work.
Yeah, so glio is one, and you often see it done with epilepsy too. So that may be a tie-in with just brain health. But for the ketogenic diet, it's very difficult to do. Oftentimes, other naturopaths who are working in the cancer field, they're saying, "Oh, you got to do ketogenic." If you look at the data, it's like, no, the data's not saying you got to do ketogenic.
I have a question about yogurt. I've seen a lot of yogurts that have pretty high sugar content. Is there one that's better than the other? Like, is Greek yogurt going to be better than, like, a Yoplait brand, or any of the others that may potentially have a lot more additives and that kind of thing?
So the question is, are there better yogurts and worse yogurts? The answer is yes. So the first thing to look for on a yogurt is saying, does it have added sugars? If it doesn't have added sugars, don't worry about the sugar content, because any dairy product that has lactose in it is going to have a fairly high sugar content. The unique thing about lactose is it's handled completely differently than most sugars in your body. For example, its glycemic index, for those who care about glycemic index, is down in the high 20s or low 30s. So in a no added sugar dairy product, the sugar content on the nutrition facts label is unimportant. Things like Yoplait and Dannon, in my view, I think it's an exaggeration to call them yogurt at all. They're really pudding, and I would tend to use the word like fraud or something like that, which is probably going to get me a call from a lawyer. So I would look for yogurts that don't have added sugars, that don't have added starches and gums. So if you take Nancy's yogurt, so we're big fans of the Nancy's company, but there's lots of other good ones, Stonyfield, Brown Cow, and so on. They often have added gums, and the natural ones don't, that to keep their texture looking good. And the way you can test this, if you ever feel like it, is to stick it through a coffee filter. And if it filters down and turns into a nice sort of cheesy product, then it doesn't have a lot of gums. If it just sort of sits there, it does. But it'll be on the label anyway. So as far as Greek yogurt is just drained yogurt. It just has less moisture content. So it's a texture issue. Have whatever you want, but have one that has minimal added ingredients.
So Greek yogurt is really just added whey protein. That's how they get the protein content up. So it's really adulterated too.
We probably have time for one more.
This is not about diet, but do you have any information you could share about the effectiveness of mindfulness-based stress reduction?
Oh. That's a good question. So the question was about data with mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so we do see studies with mindfulness-based stress reduction, really coined the term with John Kabat-Zinn and meditation. And so what they found is when we do things that help us reduce stress, we're going to see improvements in other ways. And so one example is if we look at biochemistry inside, oftentimes it's going to increase parasympathetic response. And so parasympathetic response, if you remember back to biology, and we have the sympathetic, fight or flight, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. When we're more in the rest and digest, that's almost when our immune system is doing its best too. And it's actually, you see a reduction in some of the inflammatory markers in the blood, one of those like interleukin-6. And so in one sense, when we do things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, we can change that chemistry internally that actually is anti-inflammatory. And I often think about when we have cancer, heart disease, diabetes, it's often related with chronic inflammation. So just working with how we respond to the world can affect that internal environment that can help promote a healthy immune system.
Some of us live in a very simplistic world, and to us, mindfulness-based stress reduction involves chopping vegetables, having meals with family, going for a walk, that kind of thing. So think in terms of stress reduction as a big field where you can actually look through your life and say, you know what, I can get rid of this. I need to do more of this. And I really think that cooking is actually a fantastic stress reducer.
So that social support piece too, I mean, data with social support and people doing better with that. But what Miles is talking about, sometimes, having people do a news media sabbatical. It's like, because oftentimes the news is not really helping us at all. It doesn't seem to change if we go week to week. It's sort of the same stuff. And you can take months off and see sort of the same themes. But there's just things. What are ways that we can reduce stress and improve the healthy relationships around us, not only with ourselves, but with our family and loved ones?
Great way to finish up. Please, everyone, give a warm thank you to Loch Chandler and Miles Hassell.